Now, for the viewers who may not recognize you, can you let them know who you are and definitely what you do?
Sure. Well, my name is Brian Porter Szucs. I'm a professor of history at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I specialize in the history of Eastern Europe, history of Poland particularly, and I've written about the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the development of Polish nationalism, and I also work in the area of economic history as well.
Wow. Okay, that's very, very interesting. Now, I can ask you, when did you develop this passion for history? Is this something that you had always been interested in, or did you kind of get into it later in life?
Oh, well, the I for the longest time was convinced I was going to be a musician, and I actually went to music school when I was young, and so I had a whole different passion at that time. But I learned at a certain point that with a field like music, hard work will get you up to a certain point, but you really need to have some special talent, some special spark that I came to the conclusion I didn't have. So I just started looking for other things to do, what else to do in life, and history was seemed like a really good landing place for me because I uh, I didn't know what to do. And history is wonderful because if it is in the past, it is history. And therefore, you can study and work on whatever you are interested in. And so, whether it be history of economics or religion or music or culture or whatever, it's all fair game for the historian. So it was actually a lack of a clear sense of direction that pushed me in this direction, which ended up working pretty well for me.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I feel like a lot of people they take history for granted, but it could be definitely rewarding and empowering, and it's definitely have an effect on the future. You know what I'm saying? Like they say, people that don't know their history, they doomed to repeat it. You know?
Yeah, well, one of the arguments that I always make when I'm talking with students about this discipline is that it isn't it's history. We never repeat history because we're always the circumstances are always changing. So it's not so much that we study the past in order to learn from mistakes or to repeat what worked well, because nothing will work the same the second time out. I like to think of history as a road, as a path, and we're walking on that path. And we can't turn around and go backwards. You can't, but you can change where the path goes in the future, but you can't go backwards on it. And so learning about the past lets you know how you got to where we are. And that gives us wisdom to chart the future path better. But I always say it's very important not to imagine that we can ever repeat that past, because our very knowledge of what happened in the past means that we're changing what's going to come in the future. That that awareness of what happened before means that we can never entirely repeat. So yeah, it's a one way path.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. You made a great point. I wanted to ask you about some of your books. Now I can ask you, is Poland in the Modern World? Is that the most recent one?
Well, the most recent one is one which should be coming out shortly, not yet available. And that's a book that examines the communist era in Poland and tries to answer the question of how it came to an end, and more broadly, how did the project of socialism in the 20th century, which was so big everywhere in the world, how did it come to be seen as a failure? And in this book, I actually challenge that assumption that it was necessarily a failure. I think it was a more complicated story than that. The book that you mentioned, the Poland in the Modern World, that's the one that came just before this one. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Now I wanted to ask you about that. When you say communism and socialism, a lot of people we hear these terms a lot, but the average person, I would assume they really don't know the difference. And like you say, communism has been viewed as failing in comparison to socialism. Is that something that has been successful, or?
Mhm. Well, I would. So yeah, these words are fuzzy, right? You ask two socialists to define the term of socialism, and you'll get three answers. It's really hard to pin down because there are so many different varieties of socialism. Uh, Communism being one of them, and I think the most common way of sort of mm, thinking about these terms is that we use communism to refer to the state socialist regimes of the Soviet bloc, of China, of Cuba, places like that. Um, and that's imprecise use of that term, but that's the way it's most commonly used. But inside the Soviet bloc, what they said they were doing and what they thought they were doing was building socialism. So they described their system as socialism, and I would argue that that's fair enough. How could we define this socialism? Well, I think the sort of most crucial definition that will apply across all the many different types of socialist systems that we've seen is that is the elimination of private investment capital. That sounds like a boring way to describe it. And kind of have all the grand ideals and the flag waving and the activism, but if we really get kind of beyond that and we look at what actually they did, they made a lot of social changes, but they're different in every different country. But the one thing that's in common in every place is the idea that investment capital, the decisions about where to put the money to decide what things get built and what things get funded and what things don't get funded, that needs to be in public hands, controlled by, well, theoretically democratically controlled, although it often didn't work out that way very well. But the idea is to make it publicly controlled so that there's a public decision in some way about where to funnel investment capital. And that's something that it really contrasts with the world of capitalism, where it's individual investors who decide whether to invest in a certain country, in a certain business, in a certain sector, etc.
Okay, okay. I appreciate you breaking that down. Now I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Poland in the modern world. Poland is a thing, or it's a course that you teach a lot about. Was it a reason that you chose Poland in particular?
Well, I think that's a testimony to my age. So when I was young, in high school, the solidarity movement broke out in Poland, and this was a massive labor movement, a massive pro democracy movement, maybe the biggest ever anywhere, if you take percentage terms. They're about a quarter of the entire population of the country joined this movement. Yeah, I don't know of another example where you have any mass movement that gets that big rate of participation. It was incredible, and I was growing up as a kid far off in the United States, and seeing the news in high school. And I have some Polish heritage. My grandmother was Polish, so I was attuned to it. And just watching this really inspiring moment of protest and pro democracy struggle was really inspiring. It sort of launched an interest in Polish affairs that retained with me. And then when I when it came time to pick a specialization, when I was pursuing my doctoral degree in history, Poland was still an area that was a really hot topic in many places around the world, because it was still the communist era, so the Soviet Union still existed, and yeah, here in the United States, there was lots of funding for studying, the people that were then viewed as our opponents in global politics, and for that reason, it was a big field. It was a popular field at that moment. Now, that's changed a lot since then, but that was the moment that sort of shaped me and got me into this field.
Okay, okay. Now I can ask you, 10 years later, do you feel like, or if you could speak on, what is Poland's position or role, or is it any importance in terms of, say, like the Russia and the Ukraine conflict?
Mm. Yeah, well, Poland's role in the geopolitics right now is very important. Seems undeniable because on a couple different levels. First of all, people in Poland are genuinely, just on a personal level, they're frightened. You know, Ukraine is not far away. If you just get in a car and start driving west out of Warsaw in Poland, you're going to be in Belarus, which has also participated in the invasion of Ukraine. You're going to be there in about 2 hours. It's not far. And then you can drive, you know, a little bit further south, and then you can be in Ukraine. It's right there. And so when you know that there's an aggressive, you know, Russian state, is something that really does make people very uncomfortable, and for very understandable reasons in Poland. And so Poland has played a pretty important role in trying to rally international support for Ukraine, because I think the leaders of Poland have the assumption that once, if Ukraine is conquered entirely by Russia, that Russian ambitions will, you know, place Poland next on their expansionist agenda. So, you know, I know that in many parts of the world there's a certain, you know, uncertainty about, well, should Russia, you know, Russia's fighting the United States. The United States is an imperial power, therefore shouldn't maybe we support Russia, since Russia's opposed to the United States. Man, I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, and I think looking at it from the perspective of Poland brings that out, because the United States is not the main player here. It's a regional conflict that is between a very aggressive Russian power and the United States has nothing to gain, not really, from defending Ukraine. They're defending Ukraine in part because of strong lobbying from Poland and other allies in Europe, because for the countries that surround Russia, there's a genuine threat there, and you know, it's I think it's too easy to see this in global geopolitical terms, when it's really a regional conflict, but nonetheless a really important one, because these are big countries that play a huge role in supplies of oil, supplies of food, grain, other things for countries around the world. So it matters, but it matters not in the sense of the grand geopolitics of American, you know, imperialism. I think I would argue that's the wrong way to approach it.
Okay, okay. Now I wanted to ask you about another book, Faith and Fatherland. You came out with that in 2011. What inspired that book, and how long did it take to complete that project?
Oh my, how long did it take? Huh, about 10 years, maybe a little more than that. It's uh, uh, these books, they you know, good work of history should take a long time. If I see somebody puts out a work of history and they've spent a few years on it, I'm going to have some questions about, did they really do the work? Because you know, that to a good historian really has to get into the local and temporal context. So in other words, you got to really immerse yourself so that you can really understand what people in a different time, in a different place were thinking, and how they were thinking. And that involves reading just tons and tons of stuff. So for researching this book, well, you asked why. I mean, one of the big, you know, the bigger sort of political and social players in Poland in the whole 20th century was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that's not quite as true now. It's a rapidly secularizing society, but back then it was very true, and even into the early 21st century, it still seemed to be true. And of course, the Pope for 38 years was John Paul II, who was Karol Wojtyła from Poland. So the role of Poland in the Catholic Church, which is, after all, the largest religious organization in the world, was pretty self evidently important. And I wanted to understand what what is the mindset, what were the goals, what were the beliefs, the assumptions that drove thinking inside the Catholic Church. And the way I did that, and sort of the hard work that a historian has to do, is I started reading sermons. Well, it turns out most priests write down notes for their sermons, and so we have historical records that we can kind of reconstruct these. And there are also handbooks written for them that give them guidance. Say, here's what you might want to talk about. Here's a nice story to tell. There's stuff like that. And so I just read, I don't know how many hundreds over the course of the whole, into the 19th century, just to kind of get a sense of, if you were just an ordinary Catholic believer and you went to church on Sunday, what would you hear from the pulpit? What would the priest say? Of course, we can't know how people reacted to what they heard, but we can reconstruct what they heard, and that tells us a lot about the society. And so I wanted to reconstruct that, and so yep, and I did a lot of that reading. And also, the church has little newsletters that they often distribute to parishioners as they leave the church, or they have magazines that they publish. And so I read, again, I don't even know how many issues of those, really just trying to reconstruct the worldview and how it came to be that this religious organization, which is part of a global church, became very nationalistic. How that was the big question I was trying to pursue, and that's more or less how I went about it.
Wow. Okay, that definitely sounds interesting. I got to take my hat off to you, like you
I
say.
gotta say, it's not interesting when you're doing it.
Well, it's definitely a
That
lot of work.
it's god awful boring when you're doing it, but hopefully the result becomes interesting.
Right, right. The book, which you completed, and you invested a lot of years and time into that. So it's definitely quality. Now I can ask you about Christianity and modernity in Eastern Europe.
So, you know, the this has been a big debate, and I have to admit that my mind is all evolving. My thinking is evolving on this question. So, for a long time, people just kind of assumed that as societies became richer and more economically, developed, that religion became less important. And scholars call this the secularization thesis, this idea that societies secularize as they become wealthier, more urban, more prosperous. And there are plenty of examples showing that this is true. And beginning in the 1990s, there was a sort of a backlash to those assumptions among scholars who study this stuff. And more people were paying attention to the way in which religion continued to exist, and very strong in the modern world. And that, sure, while the educated intelligentsia, the elites, tend to secularize and become less religious institutions remain pretty strong, and still have an enormous political role. And I think that the case of Poland was one of the ones that caused some of this reassessment, because here's a totally modern European country that had, a hugely prominent Catholic Church. And then as we move into the 21st century, in after 2001, with the attacks on the United States by Al Qaeda, there was a sudden recognition in my country here that that political Islam was a factor, a major world factor that we needed to take seriously, and not just assume that the religion was going to fade away with economic development. It was still a very powerful factor. So you see among scholars in many different areas of the world, many different religious traditions, starting to reassess what is the relationship between modernity and religious faith. And so there's this increasing emphasis on, people would use the phrase, there are many modernities, right? There's a secular modernity, but there's also a religious modernity, that there are other kinds of, there are ways of being modern. And that it doesn't necessarily imply that in any given time or place that religion is going to fade away. That's what I was participating in, that sort of intellectual movement, 20 years ago or so. And I think my writing was very much part of that. But I admit that I am a little unsure now whether whether maybe some of those arguments went too far, because what has happened, in fact, in Poland, what I study, is that yes, religion remained important much longer than it was elsewhere, but then it did in the end decline. And as it, there seems to be a pattern. There does, in fact, seem to be a pattern, at least in Poland, where now the country is much richer than it used to be, and it is much more secular. And we're now at a position where about the most recent statistics I saw showed that about, what was it, 37% of the population actually attends mass on Sunday. And that's a huge change from just a generation ago. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether there is something to this generalization about secularization accompanying wealth, or at least accompanying modernity in its capitalist variety. Does seem to erode religious practice, but well, we'll see. Historians of the future will have a better picture of this, maybe.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Okay, I wanted to ask you about one more project. When nationalism begins to hate, if you could speak about what that book is about and what inspired you to write that.
So that was my first book. It's a long time ago now, and I'm very grateful to that book because it got me hired at the University of Michigan, and it's helped me get started in my career. Um, the so Nationalism is a strange thing when you look at it globally, right? Because we use this phrase nationalist to describe a lot of really different people. We speak about Gandhi in India as a national leader. We speak about the national independence movements in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And when we're talking about these movements, we're talking about movements that are generally seen as on the left politically, that are generally understood as progressive, however we might define that term, and they're fighting for, against injustice, the injustice of colonialism, the injustice of imperial domination. That's nationalism. But nationalism is also a movement which leads to things like the Nazis in German history, or white nationalism here in the United States, which is such a dangerous force in our country today. And so, there's this ambiguity about the concept of nationalism, that it can be both of these things. And so, why is that so, and how is that so? So, sort of maybe approach an answer to that question, I went back to look at nationalists of the 19th century, And if we look at that time period, we see nationalists being very universalistic. It sounds contradictory, but they thought that we're fighting for freedom, for the cause of national freedom. And if, and anybody fighting for national freedom, wherever they are, is part of our struggle. And so it's all about all nations should join together and fight for national liberty. But then, if we fast forward a little bit and we get to the beginning of the 20th century, this same movement had changed, had morphed. It basically accomplished its goals. And there was a Polish state that was established, an independent Polish state in 1918. And it became a site that was where there was a lot of violence against national minorities. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Jews, Lithuanians, people who were marginalized in that society were described as national minorities, and they were oppressed. And so, following this process was something that I think it is important, because I think we see it in a lot of different post-colonial settings, where national movements of liberation will then very quickly turn into political movements that can be quite oppressive. Doesn't always happen, doesn't have to happen, but it certainly happens a lot. And so in that book, I was just trying to get to the bottom of what are the processes that push things in that direction.
Okay, okay. I appreciate you breaking that down. I mean, a lot of the books and the things that you're speaking about, I find them so interesting, and I'm definitely processing the information. I wanted to just ask you, have you ever thought about doing a documentary on any of these subjects?
Oh my. I'm, my own skill set is with the written word, and I don't think I quite have the inclination, the visual inclination. Plus, it's that it's really hard. I have enormous respect for people who do historical documentaries, because it's very, very hard. Uh, Prior to, I don't know, the last 50 years or so, the images that we have at our disposal are very limited, and they're very selective. And so it's so easy when you try to use a visual medium to talk about the past, to reproduce whatever the assumptions and preconceptions of the photographers of the past had. And it takes a masterful filmmaker to find ways of moving around that, of adopting a critical eye towards the images that come to us from the past, because they're all so because they're so rare. Even if we're talking about the early 20th century, certainly if we're talking about the 19th century, the images are so selective. And so I'm just old fashioned, but I think I'll stick to using the written word to convey my messages.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, I definitely had to ask. I mean, I take my hat off as well to a director and a producer, all the people that put in the work, especially the editors behind the scenes to compile, that 60 minutes worth of footage. Because, like you say, depending on how far you go back, you might only have pictures, so you got to keep the
Mhm.
person's interest. But sometimes, they make them phenomenal, and then sometimes they turn into movies or television series, and different things like that. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I have
yeah.
great respect for the people that can do that and can find ways to do it creatively. Creatively in ways that allow us to have a critical stance towards the images themselves, and not take them, because the images are so powerful, right? And if we have images for something, it rises to the top of our attention. And if we don't have images for it, we then find it hard to remember and hard to analyze. And so, to find ways of using image and film that treats those images as objects of study for critical analysis. That's the tricky part, and that takes a real master.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So we're about 30 minutes in. So I want to definitely thank you again for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you taking out the time to stop by. I really appreciate the work that you have done. and I definitely look forward to the work that you have coming in the future.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate this invitation. It's a great honor to be on your show. Thank you very much.